Crescent City, Florida, a quiet town tucked between lakes and moss-covered oaks, hadn't seen much change in decades. Locals often said the town whispered its stories to those who listened closely. One such whisper came from a patch of land off Denver Road. Overgrown with palmettos and wild grasses, the 4.2-acre lot sat mostly untouched for generations. There were no billboards, no fences, just stillness and shadows that moved when the wind carried the past. To most, it was just an empty lot. But to a few older residents, it was sacred ground. Eleanor Green, a retired school teacher and lifelong Crescent City resident, passed the corner every Sunday after church. Her grandfather was buried somewhere on that land, or so her mother once told her, under the tall pine just past the crooked oak. There were no visible markers anymore, just a memory passed down like a family recipe. But something changed in the summer of 2024. Without warning, a sold sign appeared. No one had heard anything about the sale, not at the town council, not at the library, not even at Millie's Cafe, where news traveled faster than the internet. Soon after, a listing surfaced online. Historical property with versatile potential. The photos showed the lot bathed in sunlight, like a blank canvas. The description made no mention of the whispers, no mention of graves. Then came the machines. Locals woke one morning to the growl of bulldozers and chainsaws. The land that had stood still for centuries was being ripped apart in hours. Trees were flattened, stones were overturned, dust filled the air like smoke from a forgotten war. No one had expected what they saw next. The dust didn't settle for days. Residents driving past 233 Denver Road slowed their cars to a crawl, rolling down windows just to be sure their eyes weren't playing tricks. Where there was once wilderness and whispering trees, now stood raw earth, uneven, scattered with roots, splinters, and a broken stone. The land had been stripped down to its bones. Eleanor Green was one of the first to get out of her car. She stood by the edge of the cleared lot, gripping her cane like a sword. Her breath caught as she scanned the site. The crooked oak was gone, the tall pine gone, and with them the quiet markers that once hinted at who lay beneath. For the first time in decades, Eleanor's doubt crept in. Maybe she'd misremembered. Maybe there was nothing left to see. But her gut told her otherwise. Others soon followed. Former neighbors, amateur historians, local veterans, even a group of high school students working on a community heritage project. All of them shared a growing unease. Everyone remembered something different about the land, but one detail was repeated like gospel. It was a cemetery, the Braddock Mason Denver Cemetery, a name not written on signs, but etched in stories passed through generations. According to town lore, it dated back to the late 1800s, used by the families of early settlers, war veterans, and freedmen whose names were often written in fading ink, if at all. Wade Alford, the town's unofficial historian and founder of the local group Guardians of American History, arrived that weekend with old maps, photos, and town records in hand. As he paced the land, a deep line formed between his brows. "This is it," he murmured. "It's all here, or it was." A volunteer pointed to a spot by the southeast edge. Embedded in the loose soil was a half-buried stone, cracked down the middle. They dug gently around it with gloved hands until the faded carving revealed itself. C.W. Braddock, 1893, one of the cemetery's namesakes. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of disbelief. By Monday morning, the whispers turned into phone calls, and phone calls turned into outrage. Word spread that at least 15 headstones once visible near the edge of the lot were gone. Some claimed they'd been moved. Others feared worse, that they'd been destroyed, dumped, or even sold. Wade confirmed something chilling. A listing on a private online marketplace had briefly shown vintage gravestones, authentic 19th century, posted by an anonymous seller from Crescent City. The listing had since been removed. The Putnam County Sheriff's Office received a formal complaint that same afternoon. By week's end, yellow tape marked off the property. But it was too late. Whatever had stood there for more than a century had already been turned to rubble, with no permits, no archaeological oversight, and, perhaps most painful of all, no respect. The new owner, a real estate investor from out of state, released a statement through an attorney. No visible grave sites or headstones were found during the clearing process. The property was purchased as vacant land. To the people of Crescent City, it felt like a punch to the gut. Because it wasn't just land, it was memory, it was history, it was sacred, and now it was disappearing. The morning after the sheriff's tape went up, Crescent City felt colder, not in weather, but in spirit. An invisible heaviness blanketed the community like fog. Children on their way to school stared at the lot with wide eyes, and elders shook their heads with quiet disbelief. It was as if the town had lost a part of itself, and no one knew how to grieve it. At Millie's Cafe, the air was thick with talk. Patrons leaned in over steaming coffee, exchanging the latest updates like sacred texts. Someone said the new owner was a millionaire from Texas. Someone else said he planned to build a luxury Lakeview estate. A third whispered that surveyors had already been spotted with blueprints. No one mentioned the dead. Wade Alford sat in the corner booth, his laptop open, documents spread across the table. He'd gone quiet, sifting through property deeds, burial records, and archived obituaries. Most cemeteries had registries, but the Braddock Mason Denver plot had long slipped through the cracks, unlicensed, unregulated, unprotected, a forgotten graveyard from a time when the living barely had names, let alone the dead. Yet the evidence was mounting. Wade had photographs from the 1980s showing upright headstones, some with flowers laid beside them. He had witness testimonies from families who remembered visiting relatives buried there. And now he had something else, a tip. A man who worked for the land-clearing crew had come forward anonymously. In a brief voicemail, he said only this: "We hit something under the soil. Felt like stone, maybe bone. Boss said, keep going." The message ended with silence. Wade turned the audio over to the Putnam County Sheriff's Office that afternoon. Meanwhile, Eleanor Green, now the unofficial face of the resistance, gathered with a small group of townspeople near the edge of the property. Some carried candles. Others held old photos of relatives believed to be buried there. They weren't protesters. They were mourners, quiet, steady, resolute. "People think cemeteries are about death," Eleanor said to the small crowd, her voice wavering but clear. "But they're about remembrance, and if we let them erase this place, we're letting them erase us." A news crew from Jacksonville arrived to film the vigil. By evening, the story had left the county and started to move across the state. The pressure was building, but the state had already washed its hands. The Florida Department of Financial Services issued a brief public notice stating they had no authority to act on unlicensed or abandoned burial grounds. In technical terms, the cemetery didn't exist, not on paper, not in any official capacity, which meant, legally, the land could be developed. That night, Eleanor stood by her window, watching headlights crawl slowly past her street. She clutched an old photo of her grandfather, a Civil War veteran who had never known a marble headstone. She didn't know exactly where he rested now, but she feared she no longer could. Across town, Wade closed his laptop. He knew what had to be done next. If the state wouldn't recognize the dead, then the living would have to. Wade Alford didn't sleep the night after the vigil. He sat at his desk long past midnight, the glow of his computer screen casting shadows on walls lined with historical maps and black and white portraits. Every folder, every tab, every image was part of a puzzle he couldn't walk away from. Not now. The Braddock Mason Denver Cemetery had never been legally recognized, that much was clear, but Wade knew that truth didn't always need paperwork. Sometimes it only needed people, people willing to stand between a bulldozer and the bones of the forgotten. By morning, he had a plan. He called Eleanor Green first, then Reverend McLean from the First Baptist Church, then the Veterans Association, the high school's history teacher, and finally a local civil rights lawyer named Tanya Ruiz, who had once fought and won a case involving an unmarked burial ground discovered beneath a shopping mall 2 counties over. They met that afternoon in the old community center, the same room where school dances used to echo with music and laughter. But today, it was filled with righteous anger and a deep, unwavering sorrow. Tanya stood at the front of the room, speaking calmly, but with fire in her eyes. This isn't just about what was done. It's about what can still be undone. Cemeteries, even unlicensed ones, can qualify for historical protections under federal law. If we prove the land contains human remains or has cultural and historical significance. Which it does, Eleanor said firmly. Tanya nodded. Then we need to act fast. Public pressure, media attention, legal filings, historical verification. If we move together, they can't ignore us. And move they did. The next morning, a grassroots campaign launched with the name Remember Denver Road. Flyers appeared in coffee shops, schools, gas stations, and church bulletin boards. A website was built overnight, showcasing evidence Wade had compiled, maps, burial lists, eyewitness accounts, and photographs of the missing gravestones. Within 48 hours, the story had been picked up by a major Florida news station. Reporters arrived in Crescent City with cameras, turning their lens toward the land that had, until recently, been invisible. Social media amplified the outrage. Hashtags like "I Protect the Dead," or "Crescent City Cemetery," and "This Land Remembers" began trending across the state. But not everyone was cheering. The new property owner, whose name was eventually revealed to be Trevor Langston, a wealthy real estate developer from Houston, issued a public statement. My purchase of this property was legal and above board. I was unaware of any existing grave sites and have seen no credible evidence that the land qualifies as a historic cemetery. I have every right to build. His words poured gasoline on the fire. Overnight, protesters began showing up at Denver Road. Some held candles. Others held hand-painted signs. You can't build over bones. This land remembers even if you don't. Graves don't expire. On the third day, a drone flying over the property captured something stunning. In a corner that had been untouched by the bulldozers, Outlines in the earth began to emerge, rectangular depressions spaced evenly. No stones, no plaques, just the unmistakable geometry of forgotten graves. The footage went viral. By now, the sheriff's office had expanded its investigation. A forensic anthropologist from the University of Florida was called in to assess the site. Ground-penetrating radar was ordered, and the people of Crescent City waited, holding their breath. They didn't have millions. They didn't have power. But what they did have, finally, was a voice. And they were done being silent. The ground at 233 Denver Road had been quiet for centuries. But now, with every test and every footstep, it began to speak. Two vans pulled up early on a gray Thursday morning, one marked with the University of Florida seal, the other unmarked, carrying delicate instruments and professionals in plain clothes with solemn expressions. Among them was Dr. Lena Harrow, a forensic anthropologist with decades of experience uncovering human remains from war zones, natural disasters, and forgotten burial sites. She had come not for spectacle, but for truth. Within hours, a grid was drawn across the cleared land. Survey markers appeared like stitches across a wounded landscape, and then slowly the radar began its work, sending pulses deep into the soil, looking for shapes the human eye couldn't see. What it found changed everything. Burial shafts, not one or two, dozens. Even in their silence, even in their disrepair, the graves still held form. Precise rectangles laid out in patterns that defied coincidence. Dr. Harrow stood quietly over the digital renderings, her voice low but firm when she spoke. There are bodies here, many, possibly over 100. Some may be uncoffined, some shallow. This is, without doubt, a historic cemetery. The news spread faster than the storm clouds rolling in from the east. By noon, a second line of yellow tape surrounded the entire lot. This time, it wasn't cautionary, it was protective. An emergency injunction had been filed by Tanya Ruiz, and a judge, watching the unfolding media coverage, granted a temporary stop to all activity on the land. The town gathered again, this time not to mourn, but to witness. Eleanor Green returned, leaning on her cane as she watched university students carefully marking each grave-shaped depression. She didn't need to know which one belonged to her grandfather. It was enough to know he was here, still here, and no longer erased. Wade stood beside her, camera in hand, documenting every step of the process. He knew this would become part of Crescent City's official history now, not just its memory. But not everyone welcomed the discovery. Trevor Langston's legal team immediately pushed back, issuing statements that questioned the scientific validity of the findings and claiming that any remains discovered were likely to be centuries old and therefore not subject to modern protections. His lawyers argued that Langston had already lost hundreds of thousands in development delays and would pursue all legal remedies to assert his rights as a property owner. To which Tanya simply responded, "The dead don't care about your schedule." That Friday, the local courthouse overflowed with reporters, historians, and residents. Outside, people gathered with candles and photographs once again. But this time, the air was different. This time, the town wasn't grieving. It was standing. Inside, Tanya delivered an impassioned plea to the judge. This land is not a blank slate. It is not undeveloped. It is developed in the most human, permanent way possible, with memory, sacrifice, and soul. You cannot pour concrete over conscience. And the judge, a man born and raised in nearby Palatka, listened. He granted a preliminary injunction. All construction, excavation, or disturbance of the property was suspended indefinitely pending full archaeological and legal review. When the announcement came, Eleanor wept, not because the fight was over, but because finally someone had listened. Someone had heard what the earth had been trying to say all along. Spring came late that year in Crescent City. Rain swept through the mossy oaks and across the battered plot on Denver Road, where orange survey flags still fluttered like quiet sentinels. The land, stripped and scarred just months before, had become a battlefield, not of weapons, but of memory and meaning. And now it was a monument. The University of Florida team completed their survey in early April. Final reports confirmed what many had suspected all along. Over 120 distinct grave shafts, many of them consistent with 19th century burials, some possibly older. Fragments of weather-worn headstones were found pushed into brush piles, and one child's name, barely legible, was recovered from a stone fragment near the northern edge. Josie M., 1887. It was official. The Braddock Mason Denver Cemetery wasn't legend, it was sacred ground. The final blow came not from a courtroom, but from history itself. An archivist at the State Library uncovered a map from 1891, tucked away in a mislabeled collection that clearly marked the parcel as Mason Burial Grounds. It had been referenced in a Civil War widow's pension application as the resting place of her husband, Private Elijah Mason, killed in 1865. That document, dusty and nearly forgotten, carried more weight than any modern land deed. Facing mounting pressure, national media attention, and the collapse of his development plans, Trevor Langston backed down. His lawyers filed a motion to relinquish ownership. He would take a loss on the property, writing it off as a bad investment. A corporate spokesperson claimed it was never his intention to disrespect the community. But Crescent City had already judged him, not in a court, but in memory. Through donations, grants, and a surge of community support, the town raised enough money to purchase the land back. The county, with help from the Florida Historical Society, designated it a protected historical site, ensuring that no further development would ever be allowed. On a warm Sunday morning, beneath a cloudless sky, the town gathered once more, but this time not to fight. They came to honor. A new wooden sign was unveiled at the entrance of the now quiet field. It read, Braddock Mason Denver Memorial Cemetery. Established circa 1800s, this land remembers. Eleanor Green, in a blue dress with her Sunday hat, stood beside Wade Alford and Reverend McLean. Behind them, students from the high school placed flowers near small handmade grave markers, each one representing a soul who may never have had one.